Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian, on this, the first Sunday of Advent. And our reading for today is actually the first section of the genealogy of Jesus from the Gospel of Matthew. And so the first verse, it says, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So Matthew is obviously tying Jesus in to the two largest figures in Jewish history, to the promises, the covenants that are made regarding people and time. And he's using an interesting word there, which we're going to get into later. But that genealogy is our focus. And then our other reading is Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, in which Isaiah is describing this vision of a future where we'll have no need for weapons of war, right? Where swords will be beaten to plowshares, and people will learn war no more because the Lord will decide our disputes. And so those are our readings for today on this first Sunday of Advent. So every Thursday, I run the Columbus Turkey Trot. It's a 5-mile race. Learned that the first year, but I thought it was 4 miles. Every year, as we're about to begin, I realized I should have trained more in the months leading up to this, but I never actually do, right? Our fourth quarter gets really busy, and so I never have the time to train, and it becomes more evident as I go through the race. I get to mile 3, and I realize why 5Ks are so popular, right? Those extra 2 miles are painful. And so I was talking with my running buddy as we're headed up towards the finish line during the last mile, and I asked him if he's ready to keep running, if he's just getting warmed up. See, in the last few years, he's done a couple of half marathons. And so a 5-mile race for him now is on the shorter end of things, where for me, it's about 2 to 3 miles longer than I'm accustomed to racing. And I was trying to imagine what would happen if I got to the finish line and somebody said, okay, turn around, you now have to go run the whole thing again, right? This would not have been welcome news. I would likely need to stop and take a break and consume the entire pumpkin pie that was waiting for me at the finish line to get the energy to go back and run another 5 miles. But, right, it would all depend on the right incentives. If somebody told me, right, they give me $5 million if I went and ran another 5 miles, I would find the energy to run another 5 miles. Heck, I'd do it if they'd lower my property taxes. Right, with the right goals in mind, people are capable of doing things that they didn't think were possible because they have this vision suddenly of something in the future that's worth enduring for. All right, just in the past few days, on Thanksgiving Day, a guy fell off a cruise ship off Louisiana, and he treaded water for 17 hours before he was sighted by another ship, and a Coast Guard helicopter came and found him and rescued him. If you'd asked him beforehand if he could tread water for that long, he probably would have said no. But, right, in the right situation, he found a way to do it, even though it might have been impossible beforehand. And so thinking about that, we think about Matthew's gospel and this genealogy, which is the word used in the ESV. But the best translation, it's really, this is the book of the Genesis of Jesus Christ. Right? What Matthew is telling us is that this is a new Genesis, a new beginning. It all starts again with Jesus Christ, this momentous occasion where everything that has come before is an introduction to the main event. It's all been leading up to this. Right? This is all a preamble. And so, right, you ask yourself, right, the people have been through so much. Right, you've been through the whole Old Testament, all of these stories, right, of death and heartbreak and violence and separation. And it's a hard story to read. And so how do they keep pressing forward? Especially, right, there's occupiers in the land. How does this community keep going on? And the reason they're able to keep going on, to keep thriving, is because of the vision offered by prophets like the prophet Isaiah. Right, in chapter 2, Isaiah is telling us about the future. Right, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the highest of the mountains, lifted up above the hills, Isaiah tells us, which means the mountain is already there. It's present, but you can't see it clearly because it's hidden by the hills. But there will come a day, Isaiah says, keep watching, because what's already present will be elevated, and then we won't be able to miss it. So we keep watching, we keep working. right? And once people see it, everyone will stream to it. We'll all go to the mountain of the Lord, we read, and there we'll learn God's ways. And what are those ways? And the primary thing Isaiah is talking about is these are ways where the people don't want war anymore. They don't turn to violence to settle disputes. They have no need of instruments of violence. The language here is striking when we read it. We don't even bother to learn war anymore because we're at complete peace with one another and there's no need. There's no imagined scenario where we would need war. Right? There's no need to keep weapons around, so they're converted into something useful. And it's funny to think about what this might look like. Imagine the kids getting to ride to school in a tank that has no other use anymore. Maybe they'd mount umbrellas on rifles and hand them out at football games. Right? Imagine a day, right, where people look at a weapon of war and have no idea what to do with it. That's the vision that Isaiah paints. Because the Lord installs peace among all peoples. And there's a story, and it's told during Greece's fight for independence in the early 19th century, and there's this Turkish garrison that's holed up in the Acropolis, and it's besieged by Greek fighters. And supposedly the Turks were running low on bullets, and so they began to carve into the marble columns to use the lead within, the lead within the columns as bullets. And the Greeks sent them ammunition saying, here, bullets, don't touch the columns. Right? The Greeks had a vision that this cultural beauty would outlast the war. And they were willing to sacrifice the present for something that lasts. They knew it would endure. And when it endured, they wanted something lasting of beauty. That's a vision worth chasing. Right? It's something compelling, and people can run to that. Right? They chase that, and that's why when they get to another Genesis, the people of God find the energy to keep going. Even if people are tired, right? They catch that vision. They find it within themselves to keep pressing forward. Right? When we discover the life and the events and the teachings of Jesus Christ, who perfectly demonstrates what God's kingdom is like. The gospel hope is fully embodied for the first time in the history of the world, and it changes the world. And for the 2,000 years since Jesus' birth, the Christian church has preached and lived out this vision for God's kingdom that we see come in the fullness of Jesus Christ. Right? It was a new beginning. God moved over watery chaos and gave a vision for a new creation. And so the church, right, has lived into that vision. And the gospel is deep and wide. Do you remember that old song that you sang as a child? You know, deep and wide, deep and wide. So God's love, right, is deep and wide. Right? So the church should be deep and wide too. And Matthew, that's what Matthew's demonstrating here in the first few chapters, or in the first few passages in the genealogy. And what's interesting in the genealogy is some of the people that are mentioned. And Matthew makes some very intentional choices about who to include and who not to include. Right? Meant to shine a light in certain places so we catch something we might have otherwise overlooked. Right? I don't want to go through all the stories, but there's one key fact that's true in here. Right? In genealogies at the time, women weren't typically included unless they brought some additional honor into the genealogy. And in this case, Matthew includes 4 women in this genealogy. And it's interesting to think about the women that are included. We would have assumed that Sarah or Rebecca or Rachel would have been included. But they aren't the ones on the list. The first woman that we discover is Tamar. Story is generally excluded from children's Bibles. She tricks her father-in-law into getting her pregnant. Not great. Next we have Rahab, who's a prostitute. Then there's Ruth, who is upstanding in terms of morality, but she's a foreigner, a Moabite, a descendant of Lot, and not a people thought of as upstanding. And finally, we come across Bathsheba, has this affair with King David. She's not even mentioned by name. So we don't have time to go through the moral failings of everyone on the list and why they're all on there. Right? But there are plenty of Matthew is making this very intentional point. First is that significant figures in church's history shouldn't be just men. The church is led by men and women working together equally. And next is that the grace of Jesus Christ reaches deep. There isn't this list of sins that crosses people out of the community. God is forming a new community here at this Genesis in the beginning of Matthew. And there's room for people with every type of background in it. No one has to shy away because of what they've done. All are welcome. And the third point Matthew is making, that there's people from every nation. Isaiah talks about this in the prophecy. And Matthew reiterates it by including Ruth, by including Rahab, these foreigners that typically would have been excluded just because they're foreigners. But here they are in the lineage of Jesus, right? The gospel is deep and it is wide, and no one has to shy away because they're not from the right place. All are welcome, right? This is the setting, this is the baseline for the new Genesis, the beginning that Jesus Christ is launching. It starts from a place that welcomes all people, regardless of background, regardless of history, regardless of where they're from, regardless of who they are. It's a new beginning. And it's a new beginning. It's a vision for one that's so compelling that we're all called to keep going forward, to keep pressing on and proclaiming the good news of God's kingdom. And it's so important, right, in the here and now. Especially when we look around at the world, right, we're tired of violence. Right? We read these heartbreaking updates from the Ukraine, day after day, week after week, month after month. We shudder to think of the lives lost, the lives disrupted, torn asunder by the war that's going on there. And it's not the only war. I found a list of 14 countries that have more than 1,000 casualties in the last year, from Afghanistan to Ethiopia to Yemen. There's violence around the world. There's violence in our own country, in our own cities, in our own communities. And it's easy to just grow exhausted from it all. And so we remember that vision that the prophet Isaiah gives us about the new beginning that we have in Jesus Christ. And we keep praying for peace. We keep working for peace. Because we believe that, right, those things of beauty will outlast the things of war. And one day we won't need weapons of war. One day a gun will be as useless as a jacket on a beautiful summer day. Right? That's the vision. And so we keep going. We keep pressing on. We keep living into God's kingdom, working for our community, serving our neighbors. Finding the energy together to love and to serve, to join with God's ongoing new beginning that we find in Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God.